In a shocking turnaround in diplomacy, the US and Ukraine have just struck a deal that may force Putin's hand. Less than a month after US President Donald Trump branded Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky a dictator, the US and Ukraine have come to an agreement. A 30-day ceasefire in the Ukraine war has been negotiated. Now, the ball is in Russian President Vladimir Putin's court. Either he accepts the deal or faces US wrath. And at least as of March 13th, he appears to be open to the possibility of a ceasefire with Ukraine. But what exactly are the terms of this new US ceasefire pact? Is Putin actually taking this proposal seriously? And what could it mean for Ukraine, Russia, the US, and the rest of the world? On March 12th, Al Jazeera reported that Ukraine and the US had just completed a fruitful 8-hour meeting in Saudi Arabia. Those peace talks saw the US present Ukraine with a plan. In return for a full 30-day ceasefire agreement, Ukraine would regain access to American military aid and intelligence sharing. Both had been cut off in the wake of Trump's disastrous late February meeting with Zelensky at the White House, leading to Russia launching a wave of new attacks against Ukraine. Interestingly, neither Zelensky nor Trump were at the meeting. Both sent representatives, much like Putin and Trump did for their Saudi meeting. This was a smart move, with tensions running high between the two presidents. Having delegates handle the negotiations helped keeping the meeting on track without major arguments unfolding before the cameras. Representing Ukraine were Andriy Yermak, who heads Zelensky's office, Minister of Defense Rustem Umerov, Foreign Affairs Minister Andrei Sybiha, and Zelensky Office Colonel Pavlo Polisa. The US sent a smaller contingent, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Together, those teams negotiate a 30-day ceasefire that will be immediate and wide-ranging, assuming Russia accepts. Posting to X in the wake of the meeting, Zelensky claimed that the ceasefire would apply to every aspect of the Ukraine war. If Russia agrees, there will be no more missile, drone or bomb attacks, not only in the Black Sea, but also along the entire front line. Ukraine and the US also released a joint statement, which mentioned the lifting of the suspension on intelligence sharing and military aid, along with something that Trump has been after for as long as he's involved himself in the Ukraine war peace negotiations: access to Ukraine's valuable minerals. No deal has been struck on those minerals yet. However, the joint statement that came out of the meeting said that Ukraine and the US plans to ink a deal as soon as possible. Presumably, that deal will also allow the US to invest in extracting Ukraine's mineral resources, leading to direct profit for the US and essentially creating a security guarantee through the presence of Americans in Donetsk. The joint statement also claimed that officials from both sides discussed aid efforts as part of an ongoing peace process, including the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. That point is especially important to Ukraine. Back in July 2023, Ukraine claimed that Russia had forced more than 700,000 of its children to leave their homes and essentially become Russian citizens. There, they could be brainwashed into believing Putin's propaganda about Ukraine, losing their Ukrainian heritage in the process. Ukraine wants those children back, along with the thousands more that have likely been forcibly removed from the country since. However, there are aspects of the war that the proposed ceasefire doesn't cover. The joint statement makes no mention of territory. Russia currently occupies around 20% of Ukraine's territory, including key regions of Donetsk, along with much of the south of the country. That could pose a problem for the US and its minerals ambitions, as two of Ukraine's largest lithium deposits are already under Russian control in the Donetsk Oblast. The statement's omission of territorial issues also means we don't know what will happen to the portions of Kursk that Ukraine currently holds inside Russia. The US also hasn't offered a security guarantee to Ukraine as part of the 30-day ceasefire. This aligns with America's policy. As Vice President J.D. Vance said to Fox News on March 3rd, if you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin doesn't invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That comes back to the minerals deal. If American workers are present in Ukraine, the US argues, then America doesn't need to send soldiers. Russia wouldn't dare attack those workers because it would be poking the American bear. For what it's worth, Zelensky claimed in a late-night video address following the Saudi meeting that security guarantees would be agreed at a later time. Regardless, a deal has been struck. As Marco Rubio posted to X following the meeting, we're one step closer to restoring durable peace for Ukraine. The ball is now in Russia's court. It might deliver a flat no to the ceasefire plan. The Atlantic Council suggested this might be the case in December 2024 in an article claiming that Putin doesn't want a peace deal. He wants to destroy Ukraine, the article argues, pointing out that Putin has publicly questioned Ukraine's right to sovereignty for years and sees it as an artificial state that should be under his control. If Putin still holds that view, talk of any sort of ceasefire that doesn't grant him full control over Ukraine might be pointless. More recently, Peskov ruled out any possibility of exchanging territory with Ukraine as part of any peace or ceasefire talks on February 12. He said, "This is impossible. Russia has never discussed and will never discuss the topic of exchanging its territory." This claim is likely why there's no mention of what will happen to the territory Russia holds in Ukraine, or indeed that Ukraine holds in Russia, in the joint statement that came out of the Ukrainian and US meeting. To the US, that part of the deal is still open to negotiation. To Russia, nothing less than claiming at least the territory it occupies in Ukraine will do. A refusal on those grounds would infuriate the US for several reasons. As we mentioned earlier, Russia has targeted Donetsk through the Ukraine war and has now made slow gains in the territory throughout 2024 and into 2025. Donetsk is important because it's home to many of the valuable minerals the US wants from Ukraine. If Putin refuses to accept the new 30-day ceasefire deal, he's essentially telling Trump that those minerals are his and he's not willing to negotiate. For a deal maker like Trump, that would be a slap in the face. It would also be a blow to his ambition to be the US president who negotiated a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. To him, this 30-day ceasefire likely represents the first step in a wider deal. If Russia says no right off the bat, Trump may ramp up his opposition against Putin. There's certainly a chance that Russia could deliver a flat no. As Lithuanian diplomat Aitvydas Bajarūnas points out to the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, Americans' decision to resume supplying intelligence and military aid to Ukraine has already infuriated many Russian hardliners. Pro-war Russian bloggers immediately responded with hostility, some even viewing it as a betrayal by the Americans. Bajarūnas says while noting that America's decision to renew weapons and intelligence supplies to Ukraine has inflamed Russia's ultra-nationalists. Putin may listen to those hardliners. If he does, and taking his own views into account, the ceasefire deal may be dead in the water. After all, a war can't stop for 30 days unless both sides agree. There are other possible Russian responses. Putin may not accept the ceasefire deal as it is right now. Indeed, on March 13th, one of Putin's foreign policy advisors, Yuri Ushakov, appeared to pump the brakes on the whole deal, telling Russian state TV that, "I stated our position that this is nothing other than a temporary respite for the Ukrainian military, nothing more." Ushakov also suggested that Russia would push for more demands, dismissing the ceasefire by saying, "It gives us nothing. It only gives the Ukrainians an opportunity to regroup, gain strength, and continue the same thing." However, Russia's leader may see the prospect of an actual deal being placed on the table as a chance to negotiate. At a news conference in Moscow on March 13th, Putin expressed preliminary support for the US and Ukraine's 30-day ceasefire proposal, stating that, "The idea itself is the right one, and we definitely support it." Signaling a willingness to begin talks, Putin also claimed, "There are issues that we need to discuss, and I think that we need to discuss it with our American colleagues and partners." Experts have long expected Putin to use the prospects of a deal as a means of pushing his interests. Keir Giles, senior consulting fellow at Chatham House, recently told Al Jazeera, "It would be strange and out of character if Russia were to agree to the current proposition without presenting additional demands. Russia has every incentive now to press for additional demands in order to agree a ceasefire." Some of those demands would likely relate to territory, as we mentioned earlier. However, there are other things Russia might want out of a ceasefire that aren't included in the present plan, according to Giles. That includes sanctions relief and permanent restrictions on security guarantees given to Ukraine. Giles believes the US may back those demands, should Russia make them, which would put the ball back in Zelensky's court. It's also telling that there are no mentions of territory or security guarantees in the initial ceasefire agreement. One could see that as the US attempting to lure Putin to the table by showing him that these issues are open for negotiation. But let's assume that Putin does negotiate and a ceasefire is eventually agreed. It might not even matter. Speaking to The Independent under the condition of anonymity, a Lithuanian official says, "What for us, Ukraine or the US, is 30 days could be just 30 minutes for Russia." The official adds, "There are lots of examples of this, though they didn't go into further detail. Ukrainian academic Elena Davlyakanova partially agrees with this viewpoint when speaking to SEPA. She says, "The real fight will continue since Russia's hybrid war will not stop and its strategic aims remain unchanged. The true clash on the peace deal specifics is yet to come, making any ceasefire fragile, if even possible." She adds that many of the concessions Russia might propose, such as limiting Ukraine's defense industry, claiming the Ukrainian territory it currently occupies, or ensuring that there are no security guarantees, would represent existential threats. Concessions that weaken Ukraine invite more than Russian aggression. They lay the groundwork for a broader war, Davlyakanova concludes. And then there's another player in this game that we haven't mentioned yet: China. Bayrunas points this out to SEPA, stating a crucial factor will be China's stance. If Beijing supports a ceasefire agreement, it may pressure Russia to comply. China may also look at the possibility of playing partial peacemaker in Ukraine as a way to open a dialogue with Trump. In early February, the US instituted a 20% tariff on all Chinese goods, with China replying with tariffs of its own. Beijing's support of a ceasefire plan would indicate China's desire to perhaps negotiate around those tariffs. China would essentially be agreeing with Trump's approach, making the US president more willing to consider a trade deal while applying the pressure Bayrunas mentions. So then, what does the ceasefire deal really mean? The answer depends on the country. For the US and Trump in particular, it would represent a victory for the often chaotic approach America has taken to its efforts to bring Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table. Trump will also have successfully negotiated a deal in which he provides no security guarantees to Ukraine, though those guarantees are implied via the proposed minerals deal. That deal would give the US a future stake in all Ukrainian state-owned mineral, oil and gas reserves, meaning the US could also celebrate the ceasefire as the first step toward a more prosperous economic future. However, there are potential roadblocks. Russia refusing the ceasefire in its present form raises some interesting questions for the US, according to British author and analyst Edward Lucas. Speaking to SEPA, he points out that Russia is winning the Ukraine war, albeit while paying a tremendous price. It's lost over 890,000 people to death or injury, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, but it occupies around a fifth of Ukraine as a result. Ukraine is running out of soldiers and Russia is not, Lucas says. How far is Donald Trump really ready to confront Russia then? The chance is small, but not zero, that he would feel just as stung by Vladimir Putin's rejection as he did by Volodymyr Zelensky's argumentativeness. Lucas seems to be claiming that a Russian refusal of the ceasefire could lead to a US response. Trump has already threatened to implement more sanctions against Russia due to it pounding Ukraine in the wake of America cutting off military aid and intelligence. Putin's refusing to play ball the way Trump wants him to could be a shot to Trump's ego, and that shot might be strong enough to convince the US to provide even more support to Ukraine if the ceasefire doesn't happen. Trump has already made the sanctions threat. On March 12, he threatened to devastate Russia's economy if Putin refused the 30-day ceasefire. As Rubio said, the ball is in Putin's court, and if it's batted back to the US and Ukraine, we could be seeing the start of a wider and longer conflict. French author and analyst Nicolas Tenzer suggests the US may be playing a longer game. Also speaking to SEPA, he cautions people about getting too excited. Even if the Trump administration may have been sensitive to accusations of betrayal, it has no reason to give up its ideological alignment with Putin's Russia, claims Tenzer. The author also believes that the US will likely take a more favorable stance toward Russia if the ceasefire proposal prompts further negotiations. Washington will likely continue to demand, if there are further negotiations, the ceding of Ukraine's sovereign territory, Tenzer adds. That makes the US something of a wild card. Right now, it's batting the ball to Putin on Ukraine's behalf. But if Tenzer is correct, it may also switch to the other side of the court if Putin proves open to negotiation and Ukraine refuses to give up territory. Speaking of Ukraine, what does this ceasefire mean for Zelensky's embattled country? It's definitely achieved a big win by convincing the US to lift its suspensions on aid and intelligence sharing. The BBC reports that these resumptions will see US military aid flowing back into Ukraine at a rate of around $2 billion per month. Regaining intelligence data also means Ukraine is again able to target Russian positions and anticipate Putin's attacks, allowing it to shore up its defenses. Sam Green, a US academic and expert on Russia, describes Ukraine's efforts a masterful piece of diplomacy in an interview with SEPA. He says Zelensky has restored American military and intelligence support, avoided being locked into a minerals deal in the absence of security guarantees, and puts the ball firmly in Moscow's court. And he's done all of that at the cost of little more than a notional promise to observe a bilateral ceasefire and warm words for the Trump administration. Perhaps that gives us a hint about what this ceasefire really means for Ukraine. Zelensky may believe that there's no chance that Putin will accept the ceasefire as it stands. Ukraine's leader is also unlikely to accept a peace where Ukraine gives up territory to Russia. Perhaps this ceasefire was a way for Ukraine to get the US back on its side so it can continue its fight against Putin's invading forces. Then there's Russia. Political scientist and Russian in exile, Mikhail Kormin, tells SEPA that there are actually plenty of reasons why Russia might accept the ceasefire proposal. However, those reasons have nothing to do with peace. First, a ceasefire would give Russia time to replenish its forces, as its recruitment and weapons production rates outpace Ukraine, says Kormin. He also believes Russia will try to push Ukraine out of the Kirks before formally agreeing to a ceasefire, which would cause Ukraine to lose the leverage it has in a territorial exchange deal. Plus, agreeing to the ceasefire also gives Russia the option of threatening withdrawal if anybody, be it the US, Europe or NATO, promises any sort of security guarantee to Ukraine. In other words, Putin may see a 30-day break as a chance to reset before resuming his invasion with replenished forces. He could also use his agreement to the ceasefire as a way to deepen his ties with Washington, which would ultimately be bad news for Ukraine. Those comments cast a different light on the ceasefire. Russia might agree, not out of a desire to end the war, but because it wants to prepare for a second phase. It could use the 30-day pause to get closer to the Trump administration and argue for more favorable terms, including territorial concessions and elections in Ukraine. Then, as the Lithuanian official we mentioned earlier suggested, Putin may simply restart the war when he believes Ukraine is sufficiently weakened. Therein lies the potential fear surrounding the ceasefire. As the BBC highlights, the use of the word immediate in the joint statement released by the US and Ukraine is a cause for concern. It implies the US is trying to rush forward its desired outcome without fully agreeing on terms between Ukraine and Russia. That creates enough wiggle room for Putin to consolidate his forces and string out negotiations until he's ready to attack again. If Putin plays that hand well, he could even cast blame on Zelensky for not agreeing to whatever terms Russia wants. After all, Putin came to the table by agreeing to the ceasefire. It's not Russia's fault if Ukraine says no to a longer-lasting peace. That only benefits Russia after that. And there's still a lot of uncertainty around the ceasefire deal. Speaking to SEPA, Vladimir Putin says that the deal doesn't tackle some of key unresolved issues remaining for the Ukraine conflict. The core questions are still there, he says. What about security guarantees for Ukraine, the peacekeepers, the role for Europe, further aid to Ukraine beyond spending the funds remaining from the last aid package, he asks. The real hard work lies ahead, Dubovik concludes. And that may indicate America's true goal with this ceasefire pact. Working alongside Ukraine, it's backed Russia into a corner. And even though Putin has responded to a potential deal by suggesting an openness to a 30-day ceasefire, he still believes there are open questions and root causes that need to be addressed. With Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff arriving in Moscow on March 13th to discuss the ceasefire proposal, the future of the Ukraine war hangs in the balance. If Putin ultimately rejects a ceasefire, he incurs the full wrath of a US that will stand even more firmly behind Ukraine. But if he agrees, negotiations to pause or possibly end the war can start in earnest. Whether that will turn out to be good or bad for Ukraine, the US and the rest of the world outside Russia remains to be seen. But what do you think about this shocking ceasefire deal, as well as Putin's response? Have the US and Ukraine just pulled off a masterstroke that puts immense pressure on Russia? Or could Putin manipulate this deal and potentially the Trump administration to get what he wants in the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for commentary on all of the latest developments in the Ukraine war, as well as ongoing conflict and military news from around the world. We're a truly independent source striving to bring you the best, most accurate and up-to-date information possible, and we sincerely appreciate your support.